Along with my day job running an investment business, I started Tinsley Park Talks, a global networking and leadership platform where I interview industry legends from finance to tech and great thinkers to notable celebrities. In these interviews, we discuss great ideas around investing, entrepreneurship, problem solving, and all other lessons of life. Welcome to another episode of Tinsley Park Talks. This program is in partnership with Crowe. For more information, please click on the link below. The initial thoughts of AI and human thinking began with the mechanical manipulation of symbols. With the evolvement of modern technology, digital programming, and mathematics, machine-based learning became the primary tool that inspired scientists to seriously discuss the idea of building an electronic brain. AI stands for artificial intelligence, and it's come a long way from catching spam in our inbox to predictive typing on our keyboards to full self-driving cars. It's even entered creative fields like graphic design and fiction writing. The conversation around artificial intelligence has changed from one of future potential to present reality. You've probably seen by now poems written by ChatGPT and hyper-realistic paintings created by Stable Diffusion. While consumers are embracing AI knowingly and sometimes unknowingly, for enterprises, however, the promise of AI is still vague and the value too distant. The CEO of Nesh, Sidds Gupta, joins us on this episode to unpack the hype around this buzzword and particularly shed light on one of the hottest areas of AI, natural language processing, or NLP, and how it's reshaping the future of the modern workplace. Sid, welcome to the show.
Hey, Najib. Good to see you. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolute pleasure, man. We've been looking forward to this episode, so I'm glad it's finally time to do it. Let's jump right into it. So we're talking about AI and a lot of things about AI today, but AI is a very big buzzword, right, Sid? Let's start with just starting to demystify the buzzword AI and what it means for business, applications, etc.
Okay, that's a really big question. So let's break it down. I'm kind of curious to know when do you remember when you first heard AI? Like in what context was the first time you heard about AI?
I think it was probably back in the days, watching sci-fi movies and, have like these aliens and robots fighting with each other. You played those video games back in the days called was it called something Fox? I can't remember. What was like something Fox?
Like movies and books, right?
Yeah.
I think it was same, right? Like the whole, I think Isaac Asimov, when you wrote like I, Robot, that was the first time I think I heard about like a robot. And then what was it, like when Wizard of Oz came out, like 1930s sometime.
Yeah.
Like you saw that tin robot. I think that was the first time where you can kind of like almost personify what an AI would be like. But then it wasn't like until it went through so many like starts and stops along the way, right? So AI has kind of changed its form and what the promise was initially and where it is today. I think I remember like Alan Turing, like when he did that in the 1950s, was his kind of first thing that you wanted to think like, okay, if people can make decisions off of information, probably machines can too, right? But the cost and the
this is the British professor, or
right. Right. British mathematician. Yeah. He was a mathematician who helped during the war, like decodify the messages that were coming from Germany.
So yeah, he was the one who kind of first proposed that maybe if people could make decisions off of information, so can machines. I think that was the first kind of genesis of the idea behind AI. That was the first time I think it was being talked in the literature, but it never took off because back then compute capacity just couldn't handle that amount of information. Computers didn't have enough memory. And then in like the 50s and 70s, I think between that time is when like AI really started taking off. Like primarily actually because of Cold War, right? It was happening and then US started investing like through DARPA a lot into AI, and actually like NLP was one of the first areas because they wanted to see what kind of text was coming, all the coded messages that they were trying to receive, like what kind of information being processed there. So that's kind of how AI essentially came into forefront. And for me, I remember the first time I kind of heard about mainstream AI was when IBM, like Deep Blue defeated like Gary Kasparov in like the chess tournament. I think it was sometime in the late 90s when that happened. That was the first time I think came into the forefront. And the first time I actually saw it in my hands was when like Siri was launched. I think I forget when it was, like probably around 2016 or something, when Apple, or 2011 was when Apple launched Siri. That's when I think the first time we heard like something like that. So I mean, in my journey, I've seen kind of AI take like a lot of different variations along the way. For businesses, though, I think that's where your question was, like, how does it affect enterprises? That's like, it's like a second coming of software for them, right? Software that they're used to is just kind of is making decisions that they would never be able to do before. Like programmers never programmed AI to catch things that they're catching now. So in the area of cybersecurity, in the area of like research, in the area of using personal assistants, general machine learning, and the area that our company operates is in knowledge management. I mean, those are all the areas I feel that an AI tool can definitely help a lot in enterprises.
Understood. By the way, I just remembered that video game I was not fully remembering. It was called Star Fox.
Oh yes, yeah.
You
I
ever play
remember
that game?
one. Yeah. I remember that one. Yes, I don't
was
think
like
if I played it, but I remember seeing the screenshots of it. Yeah,
It was like an intergalactic kind of a
Star
game.
Fox.
Yeah, one of my favorite games in the 90s. Sid, maybe helpful to take us back a little bit to your original background and roots, and how did you arrive at this juncture of taking that leap into entrepreneurship would be helpful.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so originally from India, as you can probably tell, I'm born and raised there. Did my undergrad in India, and then moved here to the US for grad school. I did my bachelor's and master's in engineering, and then eventually ended up in the energy sector. That was my kind of specialization. So I spent most of my career in my life kind of at the intersection of those two, energy and software. After grad school, I went to Houston and worked for a very large energy services provider called Schlumberger. You probably heard of them as well. So
I have, yes.
worked with them for many years. About like 12 years I was with Schlumberger, managing like their software portfolio, like all the different products that Schlumberger would build for the energy sector. I was managing a couple of those products. So that's kind of where I spent most of my time. And then through that journey, I really got interested in artificial intelligence and just how enterprises were using software and starting to use AI. This was kind of back in 2012, 2016 kind of timeline. And then through that time when I was at Schlumberger, it was like a phenomenal experience, by the way. But then like as you know, the energy industry was kind of going through a couple of different cyclical downturns then. Schlumberger went through it as well. We downsized quite a lot. We downsized about 30,000 employees during that time. And fortunately, I somehow still managed to keep a job. I had a job, but it was very hard to function when all the experts around me were all of a sudden gone, right? Like one day, like all these experts who I would constantly rely on were no longer around me. So it was very hard to function and go find an answer to something, go ask somebody, how do I do this and do that? So lived through that, like a very rough 2 years doing that. And then that's what led up to the idea behind Nesh. So Nesh was like, okay, well, what if we could have prevented this from happening? We could have captured knowledge before it was too late, before an expert departs an organization. So that's the basic idea with which Nesh was born, and founded the company back in 2018. And then over time, kind of went from energy into chemicals into sort of more general industrial space. So that's kind of where we are today.
It's a great story. Obviously, I'm familiar with your journey a little bit. I've known you for a few years, almost half a decade now. So for audience that don't know what Schlumberger is or what particularly they do in the energy industry, may be helpful to just to give a little context on the services, what services companies do versus the actual production companies that are extracting the oil out of the ground.
Yeah, so like
the energy sector or the oil and gas sector is kind of broken up into a couple of different areas. There's the upstream side, and then there's the midstream and the downstream side. On the upstream side, there are companies who actually drill and produce the oil. Down midstream is transporting, and downstream is actually refining and sort of retailing. On the upstream side, there's like companies who actually produce the oil, and then there are companies who are on the services side. So Schlumberger is one of the largest service companies in the world. What we did is we helped the operators produce the oil and produce it more efficiently. So this was like giving them tools to essentially assess what their reservoir quality looks like, and then giving them software to do the same and to optimize the production when the well starts producing. So the services companies essentially help the operators run their field and produce things better.
Great. Yeah. And you were on the software side of things. So the reason I wanted to bring up the actual services that Schlumberger was providing is because this would explain the complexity of the types of variables you were dealing with as a software engineer that was covering such a vast, complex supply chain.
Interest gas prices devastating.
While the world fights uncertainty, Crowe will help you embrace it. Embrace volatility. Crowe.
You mentioned the sort of mass exodus that happened during the last downturn of COVID, but the one before that. I think it was around 2015, 16 timeframe, right?
Right.
When prices went from almost 100 something to like down to 25, remained depressed for a while. It was similar if you think about it and compare that period. It was very similar to like what happened in 2008 financial crisis in the financial services space. A lot of investment bankers, hedge fund professionals left the industry. They didn't have jobs. Same thing happened in that sort of downturn. And there are a lot of people leaving jobs. And that's when you had the idea of Nesh. Can you maybe talk a little bit about the exact problem that you saw happening as a result of this mass exodus and people leaving, and what Nesh was going to do to solve this problem?
Yeah, I mean, the vision was that like there's so much domain expertise in these organizations, right? It's not just like regular operational things that they're doing. There's a lot of domain knowledge that is required to essentially help these companies produce energy better and optimize their operations. And this domain knowledge often isn't codified, right? It's like usually a lot of things is in people's heads, things that they have written, things that are kind of scattered all across the organization. So when an expert essentially leaves the company, it leaves a huge knowledge void in the middle. How do you plug that gap? That was the vision. Like, can we create almost like a virtual expert, a digital twin of an expert, if you will, that can answer questions as if that expert was still around? And it wasn't for the extreme situations. It was also for like somebody goes on vacation or someone goes on parental leave, or yes, worst case scenario, they leave the company. And you could still kind of plug that gap and find answers. That was the kind of the idea behind Nesh. But it was like, how do you bring in NLP, but combine it with like the domain language and the domain learning to create something that is tailored for that industry?
So you guys are working on a really hot space called NLP. But there's also been a lot of buzz around ChatGPT that's been going around, and people are just really excited about this new technology. Can you maybe shed some light in where you fit in with NLP and how all these other amazing, cool tools that are out there relatable?
Yeah, I knew you would ask me about that. I mean, ChatGPT has been like all over the internet over the last couple of weeks, right? I mean, yeah, it's a really good timing for that question. So, I mean, NLP is essentially, it's short for natural language processing, right? So it is a branch of AI that strives to give machines the ability to understand and respond to human language. That's the idea of like what NLP is. And ChatGPT and GPT-3 and anything that OpenAI does in this space, essentially what they're trying to do is create large language models. These are like basically massive language models. And what a language model does essentially tries to predict what the next word or a next few words in a sentence should be if you give it an incomplete sentence. That's the essentially idea of a language model. It tries to give you a probability of what the next word should be. So if you think about like machines can't think in words, right? Machines have to think in numbers. Like when you give it an image, the way it translates an image into a number is by looking at a pixel, right? It turns the image into pixel, and then from a pixel, it understands what these numbers are. Similarly, for like NLP, a machine takes a word and converts it into a vector. And then from that vector, it can understand what is the word that should follow. If I give you a sentence, you can complete it. So that's the basic idea. So what OpenAI has done, it takes massive amounts of language data from all over the internet, all different contexts and domains, and it tries to generalize it and creates this massive language model called GPT-3. And then ChatGPT is actually based on it. What Nesh does, it's actually really interesting, is because ChatGPT is trained on public data. It cannot be used on an enterprise's own data, right? Because the models are so massive, you cannot retrain it on a company's own internal data. It's just computationally impossible to do it. What Nesh is doing is trying to provide that ChatGPT experience that you have on public data for enterprises. So for enterprises, they could come in, they could train Nesh on their internal corpus of knowledge, and then they could ask a question and get back an answer to that question. So that's how kind of like how NLP, ChatGPT, and Nesh sort of fit in with each other.
Got it. So you already answered the question on how do corporations use NLP. Does it make sense to maybe expand a little bit more on how that's solving some of the modern day workplace problems?
Yeah. I mean, NLP is like so broad. Like, and Nesh isn't solving like all of the world's like or all the enterprises like problems, right? Because there's so much that an AI application of like NLP can do. Like if you think about like spam in your inboxes, right? Like spam filters, that's NLP. Like enterprises use that a whole lot. Like search within your company, that's NLP. Like being able, like in healthcare, like being able to kind of look through clinical diagnosis notes, and finance, like looking at like credit scoring or looking at insurance claims, or in retail, looking at like product search. All of that is NLP. There's a lot of different use cases where companies could use it for. But there's sort of like specific areas that a company like ours can help when it comes to like knowledge management. But in NLP, there's a lot of different use cases that an organization could use Nesh for.
And just to kind of clarify that, Nesh is not only focusing on energy, but because that's one industry. As an example, we talked about how complex it is. That's where you guys kind of got started. But there are obviously a lot more applications. You mentioned healthcare and other industrial businesses as well. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about the sort of the agnostic nature of Nesh and what areas it could really solve problems as far as industries go?
Yeah, so we started out in the energy sector, you're right. And then today we essentially serve the heavy industry sector in general. So energy, chemicals, heavy machinery manufacturing, aviation and aerospace. Those are some of the industries that we are helping out. The sort of the common denominator between all of them is they have a lot of technical knowledge that needs to be sort of democratized across all the people who need it within the organization. So yes, I mean, a technology like this could be used by a lot of different industries, but us being a focused kind of startup that we are kind of selling to some specific verticals today.
So why now? Why is NLP important now for enterprises?
That's a really good question. I mean, for a couple of different reasons, right? So one is that the type of companies that we're working with, these industrial companies, they have this particular kind of nature of their talent distribution. So if you look at their talent distribution versus age, it's like you see a bimodality in it. So there's a peak of people on the left-hand side and the peak of people on the right-hand side. The people on the right-hand side, they're maybe like 5-6 years away from retirement, and there's a lot of people in that peak. And then also they have this young pool of talent who is entering the industry. And there has to be some way to capture knowledge from this right-hand peak to transfer to the left-hand peak. And most of the people on the right-hand side, they're actually SMEs. They're subject matter experts whose knowledge needs to be captured. So about 40% of the staff could be lost because of this. So I think that's one of the key reasons for why now, like why these companies care. And what has happened is the whole retirement process is sort of sped up a little bit, like through the pandemic. And like the interest rates and pension and all of that, like it's causing an acceleration in which this change is happening. So I think that's one of the main reasons why I think companies care about this particularly now.
Well, it makes perfect sense. Perhaps could you share a use case with a customer where they used Nash and had some real ROIs and results?
Yeah, I mean, one of our customers is a very large chemical manufacturer, one of the largest in the world, chemical manufacturing companies. And what they have done is they also realized that like about 40% of their technical staff, like who were working in the technical services division of that company, were within like 3 to 5 years of retirement. And their upper management was generally freaking out, like, how do we prevent this knowledge from walking out the door before it's too late? So what we help them do is capture all of their technical knowledge around the products that they sell. So like safety documentation, specifications, use of the product, transportation of the product, any kind of technical training that is required around the product, regulatory information about the product. So everything we captured, and Nesh was able to kind of train on that. And then whenever somebody had a question, they would be able to find the answer to that question without necessarily relying on a specific subject matter expert to be always available. So we built this kind of digital twin of a subject matter expert around the technical services for this chemical manufacturing company. So that's one of the use cases that comes to mind that is kind of very close to the idea that I described to you on why this is so timely.
Got it. And so like in a large manufacturing or chemical company, for example, in this example, when you're approaching them, who are the sort of people within the organization and what kind of roles are they in that would understand the value of NLP and Nesh?
So I guess most of the time it is like a technical services side of the company. So technical services means a lot of different things in a lot of different organizations, but it does a few different things kind of very distinctly. So it could be that they act as a technical support for a client. They look at the voice of customer for the client to find new opportunities for them. They look at a lot of quality data that is coming around the product. They look at standard operating procedures, safety documentations. They look at regulations and policies for that industry. They're also like generating training material to train like either customers or even to train new employees joining the team. So those are the areas that like the technical services department touches. And as you can probably tell, there's a lot of like information that is very rich and domain specific.
Yeah.
Those are the personas within these manufacturing companies where Nesh can really help.
Yeah, and I'd imagine that's also a very, very broad, the technical services space would be just a very broad area. You mentioned regulations, product development, customer relationships, some it just, I guess, would depend on the organization too, right? That they might have a lot of different groups. There could be R&D group, there could be sales group, there could be project management, product development group. Am I correct?
Right. Yeah, correct. Yeah, there's a lot of different areas that it touches, but that's how we have been kind of thinking about like if Nesh were to learn about an organization, we don't want to learn everything because there's HR,
Right.
there's finance,
Absolutely.
right? There's
Right.
just so much so we are very focused on like the product that the organization makes and anything
Right.
that is related around that product. Anything that could help them support and serve and sort of scale that product. That's the area that we kind of focus on.
Okay. So let's pick a domain. It's your choice. You pick one. And then talk about exactly how the NLP solution works. Sort of maybe run us through a simple step-by-step and how do you get involved with the organization, and then how do you start solving the problem or get sort of kinetic with the business that you're partnering with?
The way it works is like if you think about any expert within an organization, right? So there are kind of like two ends of a spectrum for an expert within a company. There could be one expert who writes a lot of information to share with the rest of the company. And on the other end is an expert who knows a lot of things, but necessarily hasn't had the time or the willingness to write down a lot of information. So those are the two extremes that we're operating in. So the way Nesh works is that we come in and we work with a client to understand what sort of situation are we working with here? Do we have a lot of content, or do you have just a lot of expertise that hasn't been documented? And we work with them through kind of three different stages. The first stage is to connect with all the technical content that they have generated over the years It could be like any of this information, like product specs, safety documentation, training material, and so on. Usually written in like PDF, PowerPoint, Word documents, and things like that of that nature. So Nesh will come in, she'll read all the content, understand what these people are talking about, how they're making decisions, what kind of language they're using, what kind of acronyms they're using. So Nesh understands this, kind of builds this mind map. The second step is to go in and look at informal communications like emails and chat messages that are going back and forth between the different team members. She understands that, adds it to the mind map. And the third step is to then look at any information that is still in people's heads that hasn't been documented, because a lot of it is that. And what Nesh does, it kind of pings them with very specific questions and tries to get an answer out of them and into the system. And this cycle just keeps repeating and keeps repeating until this corporate brain gets built up. So that's the way in which we work with our customers. It typically takes about like 6 weeks to 10 weeks to get Nesh set up and running within a company. But this is the general kind of workflow that we go through.
Got it. Would it be helpful to maybe see like the interface of Nesh and what it looks like? I think it would be kind of exciting for the audience to look at what Nesh actually looks like.
Oh yeah, sure. Let me see. I can pull it up for you. I can share my screen. Yeah, so this is what Nesh actually looks like. So you can see over here, I have different avatars that I can ask a question to. So I have like a market research avatar, I have a product support avatar, I have a regulations and policies avatar. So all I do is just go in and ask a question. So
Hey, Sid,
I can ask a question.
So just to clarify the avatar. So we talked about SMEs, and for those that don't they're not familiar with that, means subject matter experts. But what Nesh is doing is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is replacing the subject matter expert with this AI technology, which is a subject matter avatar. And that avatar is a character named Nesh, correct?
Correct. Yeah, I should have probably started there.
No
So
worries.
an avatar is like a digital twin of an expert. You could have as many of these as you want. In this case, we have kind of 3 in here. Just
Which
to
we
give you an
talked about,
example of,
depending on the domains that we want Nesh to become an expert within, correct?
correct. Yes. So in this case, I have one version of Nesh that is an expert at regulations and policies. So if I ask it a question, let's say, how does carbon recapture affect the taxpayers? That is a regulatory question. You can see Nesh is trying to generate a summary. So it generates a summary that is very specific to this. And it says, here's how carbon recapture will affect the taxpayers. And below it, you can sort of see all the individual documents where it went and found the answers in. But the summary is what, and the summary is essentially a really powerful way to get an answer to your question. I can switch to a different avatar. I can go to like product support, let's just say, and you will see that I don't get a summary because this avatar doesn't know about that question, but I can ask a different question. Mm-hmm. Why cellulose nitrate in paint? That is a very product specific question. And again, you can see a summary comes back. And the summary comes back and tells you, here's why cellulose nitrate is in paint. You can see I also have an expert answer that I provided sometimes back in the day, and it kind of found my answer versus everything else that it found from the other corporate knowledge sources.
So to point out, sorry, I was just going to add that in addition to Nesh's ability to go and extract this information from all the source of information that it's been connected to, which are very unstructured, there's also an element of an actual expert's answer, which in this case, you are the expert here because it's of the demonstration purposes. And that answer also is not just any expert can go in and put any information in and deem it to be a valid and legitimate answer. It's somewhat governed as well, if I understand it correctly, right? Within certain administrative hierarchy within the organization, within that domain that Nesh operates under too, right?
Correct. Yes. So like if when somebody asks a question, they get an answer. If they do not like the answer, an expert can come in and train the system. If the answer is not found at all, then an expert can actually go in and answer the question for them. So it's like constantly trying to learn by talking to the real experts within the company to make sure that relevancy and accuracy is being provided to the end user. So it has a human in the loop, and the expert is kind of helping the machine learn along the way.
Awesome. Thank you. This was great. So maybe let's say I was this big conglomerate and I manufacture, beauty products, whatever, I have chemicals, I have a huge supply chain. I come to you and I say, Sid, I'd love to see how Nesh can solve some of my problems. I do have a lot of unstructured data, all the problems you mentioned, but how do I quantify the return on investment? How would you answer to that conglomerate?
Yeah, that's the value of knowledge management and knowledge retention is very kind of tricky to compute. And like through our kind of journey of working with different customers, we have found like a few different areas in which you can actually put hard numbers. Like one is around like the value of knowledge recreation, not creation, but recreation, because every time somebody leaves and you have to then recreate the knowledge, there's a cost associated to it. So that is one factor that you can compute. The second is like, how much does it take for you to retain an employee so they don't get burned out? Because burnout is a real issue. And I think it has kind of surfaced itself more in the last couple of years. When people are running around trying to find information, it puts an undue amount of stress on them. That is really like, it can be eliminated. So how do you reduce the burnout? How do you kind of reduce the employee acquisition cost if you have to rehire someone? Another one way to look at it is sometimes when employees leave, they would come back as consultants. And they often come back as consultants at a much higher rate. So can you shave off a little bit of that cost if you can retain knowledge in a more effective way? Non-compliance or reducing the risk of non-compliance is another way to look at this cost. Really interesting one that we have seen is that when companies invest in a technology like this, they can actually lower the experience bar that is needed for somebody to operate at a certain level. So what I mean by that is like they've seen that people with 3 to 5 years of experience can actually start working with somebody like 6 to 10 years of experience if they have access to the right knowledge. So think about the amount of money you can save if you hire somebody with 3 to 5 years of experience and help them graduate to 6 to 10 years in a very short period of time. So that's another way. So those are some of the areas in which people can really put numbers and get like hard dollar numbers out and quantify the value.
Okay, that's very helpful. So oftentimes you hear people talk about the risks of AI and is it going to destroy the universe or take our jobs? What are your sort of views on just general risks of AI and maybe particularly NLP?
Yeah, I mean the space that we're headed into, it's becoming kind of grayer and grayer by the day, right? Because as these generative AI models are coming in, you've seen you mentioned some of those early on with like people creating art now and people writing fiction now.
Yeah, stability
it's
diffusion, hard. Right? Chat GPT, yeah.
Right. Yeah, those. And when these AI models start creating content, it's kind of hard to draw the line as to who owns the information that is being created. Where's the IP? And I think that's the part where ethics and like sort of the fine line has to be drawn somewhere. I don't know if you kind of read about this, like Microsoft released a tool called AI Copilot, which was essentially a way to help programmers write better and faster code. Now, when these programs started writing code, they actually started writing code that belonged to somebody else. So it was writing code that belonged to somebody else. It was writing proprietary code. And Microsoft was essentially sued for that because they created the software and who else would you go after, right? So that's the problem, right? If you build a software and a software does something like this, is it a company's fault? Is it the software fault? Is it the user's fault? Those are the areas that we kind of need to look into. And I think that's the place where NLP, because NLP plays in that space, I think that's the area that we need to figure out. I don't have a really good answer. I'm kind of looking at the use cases that are coming out over here, especially as we start generating text and start creating original text. Who owns the IP for it? I think that's a question that we'll have to answer.
And Sid, what about biases? Can you share what biases are and then also how that's also a risk factor?
Yeah, so any AI model is trained on historic data, right? So the amount of historic data that it sees, it picks up patterns and it tries to kind of figure out what is there and it tries to extrapolate it in the current use case. So bias is actually a big issue because as humans, we tend to have biases that we have written in the past. Like AI can go and read that and then try to apply that bias going forward. Like for example, if it reads that a lot of the content is around like mom cooking food in the kitchen, when you try and ask a question like who should cook food, it may tend to give the answer is mom, right? And it is a bias because dads can cook really good food too. So these are the types of situations I'm trying to describe. If you give a training data that is biased towards a certain thing, it will try to extrapolate it when you train it on that and try to use it for a future use case.
Makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. So before we conclude today, I want to just ask you about the future of AI in general. We're seeing very fast progression with stable diffusion and all the other work OpenAI is doing. What can we expect from you guys in the next 2 to 3 years at Nesh?
I mean, I'm very, very optimistic at the speed at which this field is progressing. Right? I mean, if you had asked me a couple of years ago, it would have been impossible to predict where we are today. Like the speed at which these models are growing and the creative spaces that these are entering into, I think this is like immensely powerful. I think what our thinking is that public data, the amount of information that Google has indexed, is actually very small. Right? It's just 4% of the world information that is out there. The other 96% actually sits within enterprises, sits within companies who have generated massive swaths of data. And something like Google and ChatGPT cannot penetrate those companies. So our vision is like, how do we take that remaining 96% or some share of it, and we help create sort of a fully immersive environment where people can have like a similar experience like Google or ChatGPT. They go in and ask any kind of question and they get back like a really rich answer, just like they have come to expect from Google and ChatGPT today. So that's the vision that we are kind of chasing. It is a very ambitious vision because there's just huge amount of data, but we are taking it sort of like one vertical at a time.
That's amazing. Hey, man, look, I'm really excited for you and for what Nesh is doing. I'm rooting for you. I know you're going to continue to be successful and kick some butt out there. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Najib. Thank you for having me. It was a really good conversation. Excited to talk to you today. Thank you.
Take care. Take a moment to please subscribe to the channel and like this video. We really appreciate your participation.